Shalom and welcome. It is a wonderful thing to be here with everyone again, those here in person and those watching online or listening to the podcast later. It is a great day to be here. Lots of fun things that we are going to be talking about. And one of the most important things, as I get ready for the audio portion also to record, excuse me, one thing also that is very important to understand is we are going to link what happened a long time ago to things that are going on today in this world at this time. And I think that's really important as we discuss it, to find out that there are things happening in the world today that directly relate to what we're going to talk about in Scripture, and where the Book of Esther actually begins all the way back into 1 Kings. But we'll talk about that as we get into the study. So for right now, if I'm going to light the candles and start off as we usually do. And remember, we are not lighting the candles out of some ritual, but we are remembering that Yeshua, Jesus, is the light that has come into the world. We are remembering that the Word of God is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. We are remembering that we are to let our light shine, and we are remembering that as we light these lights at sundown to start the Sabbath, we are resting now for the Sabbath day in the light of the Messiah's love. Well, let's see. There's always got to be one, right, that doesn't like to light up. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments, and for whom we light these Sabbath lights. All right, and now we are going to recite the Shema, a traditional part of our liturgy out of Deuteronomy 6:4. And it's customary to face the east. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his glorious name, whose kingdom is forever and ever. Amen. All right, you may be seated. And thank you all again for joining us. And we are going to get into this. So I'm going to say a traditional blessing that is said as we partake into an actual study of God's Word, of His Torah, which is far more than just the first 5 books that a lot of people think it is. Hang on a second. Why is this recorder not working? Hang on, please. Technical difficulties. I'm trying to record for the audio podcast, and it is choosing to have a mind of its own. It's saying that it can't access the microphone for some reason. Oh well, I'll deal with that a different way. So thank you again for being with us. And as I open in this prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by your commandments and who has commanded us to engross ourselves in the study of your Torah, your word. And so thank you. And tonight we are going to talk about a festive occasion, one of the most joyous times on the biblical calendar, called Purim, P-U-R-I-M in English. And it's basically the Book of Esther, which we will be studying, but it starts long before that. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let me talk about a few basic things first. Number one, if one were to read the entire Book of Esther and really pay attention to what you're reading, there is something different in the Book of Esther that you will not see in any other book of the Bible. It is completely different in this way. And that way is that the Lord, or any reference to deity, is not made in any section of the book. The Lord is not mentioned, God is not mentioned, any sort of deity, any sort of spiritual being is not mentioned in the entire Book of Esther. And yet we will see as we study tonight that there's something very significant about that and what it tells us about God working, shall we say, behind the scenes. Even when we don't actively see that he's doing things, there is no way the Book of Esther could have ended the way that it did, except for the hand of God. So what is the basic message? According to the biblical calendar, if we start to read in the Book of Esther, verse 9, kind of culminating all of it, but we're going to go back, it says in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, which is where we are right now, on its 13th day, on the day that the enemies of the Jews were expected to prevail over them, it was turned around and the Jews prevailed over their adversaries. The story that we are going to read is one that is very common, even today, about how people following something other than the Lord decided that we should kill the Jews. That's what they decided. And so let's go kill the Jews for sport, and yet we will find out that God did it a different way, and God had a different plan. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Don't you agree? I mean, look at what's going on in the Middle East today. Nothing has changed. The enemy wants to destroy the Jews, and we have this in the Book of Esther. And so they gained relief after this, and on the 14th day, they made it a day of feasting and gladness. Well, Adar, the 14th, is this Sunday. Well, wait a minute, Susie, isn't that Palm Sunday? Well, according to a very pagan calendar, yes, but Passover isn't for another month. The Last Supper is not for another month. This year, the church is celebrating the resurrection a month before the crucifixion. That tells you something about how messed up the calendar is. But besides that, this coming Sunday is the 14th of the biblical month of Adar, and therefore it is Purim. And so that's why we're talking about it now. Purim is one of the most joyous and fun holidays on the biblical calendar. It commemorates a time when the Jewish people living in Persia were saved from extermination. And the interesting thing is that ancient Persia is modern day Iran. And the Iranians want to kill the Jews. Nothing has changed. There is nothing new in the New Testament. There is nothing new under the sun, like Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes. There is nothing new today. So let's go through an overview of this book. Chapter 1 opens with King Ahasuerus of Persia proclaiming a banquet, which followed 180 days, about 6 months, of a great display of his wealth and power. He was telling everybody, I am powerful, I am wealthy, glorify me. The banquet party was held for all of his noblemen and his advisors, full of drink, all sorts of sexual and other sin, and it was a day of pure flesh, this party. The Queen Vashti at the time, held a separate party for her friends and for the women. On the 7th day of the drunkenness and worse that was going on, Ahasuerus ordered Vashti, his wife, to appear before the men. While they were all drunk and participating in orgies, he called for his wife to come and entertain his drunken friends. He wanted to show off her beauty and probably pass her around. Vashti refused. Vashti doesn't get much credit today, but the reality is she refused. She knew that this would not be right. Even though she was not a believer in the one true God, she just knew this was wrong, and she refused. It's often overlooked that if Vashti had not refused, the rest of the story could not have happened. In her own way, she also was a heroine for refusing the sinful command of her husband and king. Ahasuerus consulted with his drunken advisors and decided Vashti, his wife, should be banished, or else all women would use her example and begin to disobey their husbands. And so this was done. She was banished out of the palace, out of royalty, no longer queen, no longer his wife. You're gone. Now, in chapter 2 of this book, of the Book of Esther, Ahasuerus said, wait a minute, now I don't have a wife. Now I have all my concubines, I have my mistresses, but I don't actually have a wife and queen now. So he decided he was going to have a beauty pageant to select his new wife and queen. These young girls were brought to the palace. Now, a lot of people will tell me or think that the Book of Esther is a love story, that he fell in love with Esther and she with him, and they lived happily ever after. Nothing could be further from the truth. This was indeed sex slavery. These girls did not have an option. They were taken into the palace, and even after the beauty contest was over, the ones even that lost were not allowed to return home. This was the end of their lives as they knew it. Hadassah, the Hebrew name for the woman we've come to know as Esther, was a cousin or niece, it's not clear, of a man named Mordecai, a Jewish man who had raised her. Obviously, she had been an orphan, and this relative had raised Esther. He advised her, Mordecai said, when she was being taken to the palace, do not tell anyone who you are, what your heritage is, what your ethnicity is, that you are Jewish. So she didn't. She kept it hidden. And this will play an important part later as we go on. Eventually, through all these beauty pageants and contests, Ahasuerus selected Esther to be his queen. The conclusion of this chapter, of chapter 2, tells us that Mordecai, in the meantime, Esther's caretaker, Esther's family, overheard a plot to assassinate the king, and he was able to get word to Esther, who told the king, so the culprits were caught and the king's life was saved. This also will become very important later on. In chapter 3, we read that the king promoted a man, a friend of his, named Haman. Now, the Bible tells us that we are to blot out Haman's name, and you will see why later. So in synagogues all over the world, when we read this story, every time we say Haman, everybody shouts, boo, hiss, or waves noisemakers called groggers, and to stamp out the name of this evil man. And so he appointed Haman to be in charge, to be second in command of the palace, and basically rule the kingdom. Ahasuerus would be the king, but Haman would do the work. And Haman hated the Jewish people. He despised them. Haman had commanded all of the people to bow down to him because of his position. But the Jews, especially Mordecai, refused to do so. They knew that they were not supposed to bow to any man. And so, of course, Haman became infuriated. In chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, it states, when Haman saw that Mordecai was not bowing down or paying him honor, Haman was filled with rage. It was repugnant in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had all told him the identity of Mordecai's people. So Haman had discovered that Mordecai was Jewish, and so Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus. He decided if Mordecai wasn't going to bow down to him, probably the rest of the Jews wouldn't either, so let's just kill all of them. Let's find every single Jew in the entire land of Persia and slaughter them all. In verse 7, we learn the date of the slaughter, how this was selected. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, that will happen next month, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, they cast lots. They cast the Pur, P-U-R. Pur is the Hebrew word for lot. Purim is plural, so casting lots. Think for a moment, where else in the Bible we are told about people casting lots for something? We'll bring that in later. So they cast this in the presence of Haman, and so the day and the month were a year from then, the month of Adar, would be the day that all of the Jews would be exterminated. King Ahasuerus gave Haman the authority to carry out the plan. Why, would you ask, would he do that? Well, Haman had told him, there is a people group scattered and dispersed among all of the people in all of the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws are different from those of every other people, and they don't obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let an edict be written to destroy them. I will pay personally 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out this business, and I'll put it in the king's treasury. So if you let me kill all the Jews, I'm going to make you even richer, O king. That's verse 7 of the same chapter. The story continues in chapter 4. Mordecai learns of the plan because he is sitting outside the palace gates with his charge, his dependent inside, and he begins to tear his clothes and go into mourning over all of this. Mordecai eventually got word to Esther about what was going on. She had heard that her uncle or cousin was outside grieving and mourning and tearing his clothes and covering with ashes, as was common when you're in mourning. And so she asked what was going on, and she learned about the plot. While she explained to Mordecai that if she went to Ahasuerus without being summoned, she could be killed. You see, remember, Ahasuerus had kept all those other young girls too. Even though Esther was his wife and queen, did not mean he was with her every night. He had whoever he wanted to at his beck and call. So verses 13 through 16 probably are the most well-known and most famous portion of this entire book. Mordecai replied to Esther with this answer: "Do not think in your soul that you will escape the king's household more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have attained royal status for such a time as this?" And that's where that verse comes from, for such a time as this. Mordecai is telling Esther, this could be the entire reason you are queen in the palace right now. God positioned you to take care of this. Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Okay, go. Gather all the Jews who are in Shushan," that's the capital. "Fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast the same way. Afterwards, I will go to the king, even though it is not according to the law. If I perish, I perish." After the 3-day fast, Esther prepared herself and went to the king. This is in chapter 5. He extended his scepter towards her, which allowed her to approach and speak. She invited the king and Haman to her quarters for a banquet. Haman was exuberant. "The queen is going to honor me. I get to go to a banquet with the queen, not just the king. I've got both of them now." But on his way home from the palace, all full of joy, he saw Mordecai and was again filled with rage because Mordecai would not bow down to him. He ordered the gallows to be built to hang Mordecai. He bragged to his friends and to his wife Zeresh about his wealth, power, and this banquet invitation. That night, the night after the invitation, the king could not sleep, and so he ordered one of his scribes to read to him about his reign. What are the great things that I have been doing while I've been in power? And then as the scribe read, he discovered how Mordecai had been the one to save his life. After consulting with Haman, he asked Haman, actually, if there is someone that the king would really, really like to honor, how should the king do it? And so Haman, filled with pride, believing, of course, and assuming that the person to be honored would be himself, he said, I think you should dress this man in the best robes and put a crown on his head, put him on the finest horse, and have one of your servants lead him around the capital city saying, this is the man that the king desires to honor. And of course, he thought that would be himself. Well, guess what? The king said, wonderful idea. So Haman, let's do this. And you can be appointed to lead Mordecai around and proclaim that he is the one that I am honoring. So Haman had to do that. He led Mordecai around Shushan on horseback, proclaiming the king honored him. This made him even more furious at Mordecai and at all of the Jews. Well, okay, then what are they going to do? Well, now Esther held even a second banquet. She had had the first one and invited them back for a second one. And during this one, in chapter 7, she revealed that there was a plot against her people. And of course, Ahasuerus was stunned. He had no clue, because remember, Esther had kept her identity a secret, her ethnicity. All of those things were hidden. And so now he finds out, and Haman realizes that she's Jewish, and that he had just proclaimed and built gallows to hang and kill all the Jews, which would be including the queen. So then he begs for forgiveness, and as he begs, in his state, he stumbles, falls with his head onto the queen's lap. Well, the king had walked away for a minute. He was so furious. And when he comes back, he sees Haman with his head in the queen's lap and just blows up. So now I step out and now you're assaulting my wife? Couldn't get much worse for Haman, okay? Haman wound up being hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. And of course, there's much more. I'm not reading every word of the entire book. But as the story concludes, we learn that the Jews were allowed to defend themselves and the plot was ended. A great festival was called. Mordecai was elevated to the king's advisor position, and Purim, this holiday, which is very festive, was proclaimed to be observed every year. Now that's the basics of the story. But now, let's go back and see what else this is going to tell us. We're going to look at some very specific verses and find out some very surprising things. Now that you have the overview of the story. In the Book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 1, it says, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and setting his chair above all the officials who were with him. Haman, an Agagite. You see, I am of the opinion that if God puts something in his word, it's there for a reason. God's not like me that he worries about word count when he publishes. I know when I go to my editors, my chapters have to be certain lengths and so many words on a page. God didn't worry about that. He didn't have a publisher he didn't answer to, that he had to answer to. So if he mentions that Haman was an Agagite, there must be a reason for that. So who were the Agagites? Haman was a descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites. Who were they? Well, for that, we have to go back to King Saul. Actually, we could go back further, but we're just going to go back to King Saul. In 1 Samuel, chapter 15, starting in verse 1, Samuel said to Saul, Adonai, or the Lord, sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore, listen to the voice of the words of Adonai. Thus says Adonai Tsevaot, the Lord of hosts. I remember what Amalek, the father of the Amalekites, did to Israel, how he set himself against him on his way when he was coming up from Egypt. So go and strike down Amalek and put all he has under the ban of destruction. Have no pity on him. Kill men, women, children, the troops, all of them. 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000, So they went. Saul advanced to the city of Amalek, laid in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, another tribe, "Go, depart, get down from among the Amalekites, or I might destroy you as well," because they have been friends. So the Kenites withdrew from among the Amalekites. Then Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah until you come to Shur, which is close to Egypt. He captured King Agag, king of the Amalekites, of Amalekite alive, destroyed all the people with the edge of his sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, as well as the best of the sheep, cattle, all of these other things. Okay? And he kept them. So this King Agag was not killed the way the Lord had commanded, and Haman descended from him. If Saul, all those centuries before, had done what the Lord told him to do, we would not have had a Haman wanting to kill the Jews. But there's even more to it than that. Then the word of Adonai came to Samuel, the prophet, and said, "I regret that I made Saul the king, for he has turned back from following me, and he has not carried out my commands." This act of flagrant disobedience was the reason Saul lost the kingdom, and why then David became king after him. If Saul had done as the Lord had directed, Haman would not have been born. The message is very clear. We must always follow the Lord's direction completely. But wait, there's even more. In Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, Amalek fought Israel after they had left Egypt during the Exodus. Joshua led the battle, and this is where you find the famous passage about Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms. And every time they held up his arms, the Israelites would win, and when they let him down, it was the Amalekites that eventually led to King Agag, that eventually led to Haman, that they were fighting. And this is why, because every time the Lord told Israel to do something, the Amalekites tried to kill the Jews. Haman was just doing what his family tree told him to do. And what it says here, you are to blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Do not forget. And so then, obviously, in 1 Kings, Saul forgot that, didn't kill King Agag. It led to Haman, and even more. Amalek himself was the grandson of Esau. Who was Esau? The twin brother of Jacob, right? Genesis 38:12 and 1 Chronicles 1:38, okay, tells us that Amalek was Esau's grandson. Exodus 17:8 through 18 tells the story of Moses and the Israelites fighting the Amalekites, okay, as we said. It's interesting that out of all of the commandments, and I'm not talking about what the church calls the 10 Commandments, but the commandments throughout Hebrew Scripture, and people say there's 613 of them, 3 of them involve destroying the Amaleks, destroy those that are going to live to destroy you. And there's even more to that. This is from Deuteronomy 25:17 through 18, Exodus 17:14, 1 Samuel 15:3. They failed to do this, which is called multiple problems. And so we're going to continue with even more of this. The Book of Esther, as I mentioned earlier, is very unusual. It's the only book of the Bible that does not contain the name of God, the name of the Lord, any reference to deity. There's no reference at all. Mordecai makes a very vague kind of reference to it when he says the Jews will be saved by someone else, if not Esther. But that's the closest the book comes to mentioning God. So here is another important lesson out of the Book of Esther. God often works in ways that are not apparent, in ways that may appear to be chance, coincidence, or ordinary good luck, but God is still in control. Whether we acknowledge him or not, He sometimes works behind the scenes in ways that are not always flashy. It's not a burning bush. It's not smoke and fire. It's not those kinds of things, but he is still working. Next month, we will be observing Passover, and at that Seder, at that observance, we will be reminded again about how the Egyptians sought to kill the Jews, but yet God saved them. In this book, Haman was the one. In the JewishEncyclopedia.com, a website, King Ahasuerus is identical to King Xerxes I, who ruled Persia from 486 BCE to 465 BCE. He reigned following a time of relative peace and comfort for the Jewish people. Although they were in captivity, they were permitted to worship the Lord, and they were able to move around fairly freely. Ahasuerus was a fanatical anti-Semite, however, and he stopped the temple being rebuilt. When Esther was made queen without his knowledge of her heritage, the plan of deliverance was put in place. Just like it was with Moses when he was raised in the palace of a pagan king who sought to kill the Jews. Just like Joseph, who rose to second in command in the palace of a pagan king to save his people. Just like Daniel, who had his dreams in the palace of a pagan king and saved his people. There are recurring stories in this spiral of time where God repeats the patterns. Following the defeat of Haman, it was very well established throughout all sorts of history books that the Jews lived in relative comfort for the remainder of Ahasuerus' reign. Haman's persecution galvanized the Jews in Persia to action. When Esther called upon her people to fast and pray for her, they did. They were awakened from the lethargy and the sadness into which they had fallen during their exile, and they went into action. They sought the Lord, they prayed, they asked for a miracle. Although the name of God and any direct reference is missing from this story, his presence and his power are quite evident. A shy girl was granted power greater than any other woman in the land, and she used it to win freedom for her people. She was young, she was inexperienced, but she served the Lord and was willing to risk her life in that process. It resulted in deliverance and an explosion of Jewish culture and thought. Persecution brought the people together under God, and he established them. Now let's jump forward to some more modern times and stories. In the last century, there have been two significant individuals who threatened the Jews, and there are so many parallels to the story of the story of Purim, that it is remarkable. I don't believe in coincidences. A coincidence is when God does something and we don't recognize that he was the one that did it. Hitler is the first of these people. We all know that he wanted to annihilate the Jews. We know the cruel ways he tried to carry out his plan. He did this at a time in which the Jews had been living in relative comfort and wealth, and where their spiritual identity and passion had somewhat been assimilated into the greater European culture. Through the Holocaust, Hitler wanted to wipe out any Jewish presence. This parallels the state of the Jews in Persia at the time of Esther. Life was normal. Jews participated in all areas of European life. As he assumed power, his rabid anti-Semitism stopped normal life, and we all know the stories. It was not until the end of the war, though, that this connection to Haman became very clear. In 1946, they held the Nuremberg trials, in which Hitler's top associates were tried for war crimes. 10 of them were sentenced to death by hanging for these crimes, which of course included the murder of the 6 million Jews. In Esther, chapter 9, verse 13, Haman's 10 sons were hanged. And guess what? The 10 of Hitler's associates were hanged on the biblical date that was the same as when Haman's 10 sons were hanged. Hermann Goering, an 11th guy, one of Hitler's main ones, committed suicide the night before the other 10 were hanged. Well, Haman's daughter committed suicide the night before her brothers were hanged. It is very well known that Goering was a cross-dressing transvestite, dressing as a woman. So he killed himself on the day that Haman's one daughter killed herself. When these 10 Nazi leaders were on their way to the gallows, a Jewish man named Julius Streicher observed and shouted, "Purim, 1946. He was quite aware of the parallel. We know, as we've already discussed, that Haman was an Agagite, descended from Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Well, centuries later, the defiance of God's command also resulted in evil power. The Talmud and other rabbinic writings and history books and anthropologists talk about a nation called Germania descending from the Amalekites. And then during the Roman dispersion, the citizens of these descendants of the Amalekites came together and formed a nation named Germania. Well, Hitler was a German. It is not proven, but it is certainly well possible that Hitler was descended from Haman, and it's certainly the same satanic spirit that did both. Okay? Remember that the Lord commanded Moses and others to not ever forget what the Amalekites did. And following the Holocaust, the cry of the Jewish people is, never forget, lest we forget. Following Germany's surrender in 1945, between 7 and 9 million Jews who had been deported from throughout Europe were released. Many were not able to return to their homes as they had been destroyed, or there were still anti-Semitic activities raging, or local violence. Excuse me. Despite British opposition and lack of any help from any other country, a wave of Jews surged into what was then known as the British Mandate. We know that in 1948, Israel became an independent, modern nation. The persecution of the Holocaust led to the founding of the Jewish homeland as a modern political entity. At the conclusion of the Exodus, the Jews returned to their homeland. At the defeat of Haman, the Jews reestablished a homeland and life of prosperity. The establishment of Israel and the prophetic fulfillment were the next step in the Lord's plan for his people. But there's even more. In 1947, after World War II was over, Joseph Stalin was the dictator of the communist Soviet Union. He, of course, was also a raging anti-Semite. Jews were sent to Siberia, all sorts of places. He began a war of terror on the Jewish population. He targeted Jewish scientists and doctors in particular. He announced that the doctors were killing Russian children by injecting them with diphtheria. Obviously not true, but he sent that around. He formed a plan in which all of the Jews throughout the Soviet Union would be deported to Siberia, the Arctic, and uninhabitable regions to die a slow, starving death. An article from the National Journal in 2003 reported newly discovered documents at that time proved that in February of 1953, Stalin commissioned the construction of 4 camps. Who else did camps to deport the Jews in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Arctic North? Stalin's genocidal plans were confirmed by a man named P.K. Ponomarenko, Soviet ambassador in Poland, in an article in the French newspaper Paris Soir. A week before the Purim of 1953, Jewish faces were not very happy. A woman named Batya Berg, author of an autobiography called Voices in the Silence, wrote this, and I'm reading from her book. In train stations all over Russia, train cars were being requisitioned to carry huge caravans of Jews into exile and slow death. Reliable sources confirmed that the expulsion would begin on the 6th of March of that year at Purim time. In his autobiography, a different book, An Autobiography to Remain a Jew, Rabbi Yitzchak Zilber recounted a story from that time. He himself, this rabbi, was imprisoned in Siberia. On Purim, after he read the Book of Esther to a group of the prisoners, one of them said, "Who needs your tales about what happened 2,500 years ago? Tell me, where is God today? It's not enough that Hitler killed 6 million of us. Here they're about to kill another 3 million of us. Don't you see the trains and the barracks that have already been built?" And Zilber replied, "True, our situation is difficult, but don't be so quick to eulogize us." Haman also sent orders to 127 provinces to kill the Jews. God will yet help. Stalin is a mere mortal. No one can know what will happen to him in half an hour. That's in pages 236 to 237 of his book. That night, 30 minutes after he spoke those words, within that half hour, Stalin collapsed during a meeting in which some of his confidants expressed that they weren't real sure about his plan. On Purim, thousands of prisoners, the first of the 3 million he had planned to exile and kill, were freed. Stalin died a few days later, and of course, his plan was never enacted. The Purim connection continues. We are seeing it today. So what are all the lessons now that we've talked about all of this? There are so many customs and traditions, to have parties, to wear costumes. It was a dress-up time for me as a child, always dressing as Queen Esther, of course. Why wear masks and why do costumes? Well, the hand of God was hidden, but he was always present. Esther hid her true identity. So did Mordecai at first. Haman hid his evil plan for a time. Yet our masks come off and all is revealed according to God's plan. So we can wear masks and celebrate, but at the end of the party, our masks come off and who we really are is revealed. The groggers retelling, yelling when we say his name to blot it out as commanded. So the lessons of the Book of Esther for us today. When we disobey God, just like Saul did, the repercussions continue, even past our own lives, as we see with Haman, with Hitler, and more. We must be obedient to the voice of Adonai, or the consequences will be great. Anti-Semitism persists. Anti-Semitism, where did that phrase even come from? Well, Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And we know that Shem is the one from whom Abraham and the rest descended. Shem in Hebrew, that word means name. If I were to say, Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai, in Hebrew it's blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Back in biblical times, people were not given names the way, my name is Susie. They were assigned something based on their attributes, something about them. So this man, Shem, this one of Noah's 3 sons, became known as the one who was following after the name of the Lord. So Shem became the father of the Shemites, and through him, of course, eventually Abraham. Well, in English, Shemite became Semite. So anti-Semitic is to be against the ones who are called by the name of the Lord. That's kind of a scary place to be, I would think. Okay? Number 3, we must understand that the Lord is present even when we do not see him. He still could be working behind the scenes in a way not apparent to us, but he will always be with his people. And lastly, like Esther, we must follow his call. Mordecai's statement that the Jews would be delivered even if she refused is important to understand. Yes, we can all remember that she was there for such a time as that one. But we are all here for such a time as this. And we have all been given things to do. Yeshua gave the command, occupy till I come. What is that? Do what I am giving you each to do until I return. Don't sit and argue about the date and the time or the season. Do the work that I am giving you to do. I know I have hoped or thought, gee, I wish I was born a couple centuries from now where I could just get on a spaceship and fly around everywhere. Or I wish I was born a couple centuries earlier so I could have witnessed all of these sorts of things. I know we have all dreamt like that. But no, God has us for such a time as this. Each one of us is in the position he has designed us to be put into for the purpose of doing what he is calling us to do until he returns. We must follow him. Indeed, when I look at all of this, I am reminded about a Hebrew song, Mi Yimalel. Now, Mi Yimalel is generally sung at Hanukkah time, which intriguingly enough is at another holiday, another festival, which celebrates the Jews' victory over a pagan king who tried to kill them. Okay? You know, in fact, the common theme that I have heard so many times about the biblical holidays are this: they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Although the body of this song refers to the Maccabees, the group of people that fought and saved the Jews from death during Hanukkah, it's another victory over an enemy that sought to destroy the Jews. For Passover next month, for Purim, for the Holocaust, for the Stalins of the world, and for today. It goes, I'm not going to sing, you'll all run out of here, but it goes like this. Mi Yemalel Gevurot Yisrael, Otan Mi Yemne, Hen Bechol Dor Yakum Hagibor, Goel Ha'am. Who can retell the things that befell us? Who can count them? In every age, a hero or sage came to our aid. The miracle of Purim, of the Lord's presence through crisis and persecution, the ultimate redemption and reemergence of his people, is the common thread of biblical and secular history. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, at that other time of freedom fighting, away from another pagan king, Miriam sang the prayer of the Mi Chamocha, Mi Chamocha Ba'alim Adonai. Who is like you, Adonai, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? And by the way, if you hadn't figured out, when I said there's another scriptural time about casting lots, it had to do with the Roman soldiers casting lots for the Messiah's robes. Another evil thing. So that, in a nutshell, is the story of Purim, past, present, future. There it is. Thank you for listening, for being with us, for watching. In 2 weeks, on April 12th, we are going to be meeting again, and I'm going to share something that I have not specifically shared as an entire message before. I've talked about it here and there, but it's going to be my actual message, and I've titled it, What About Easter? Where does Easter fit into this? We have Purim now. We have Passover next month. The Last Supper is a month away, a month after what the church is celebrating as Easter. How did that even happen, number one? How in the world did the tradition of the Easter ham come about? Certainly wouldn't have been eaten at Passover by the Jews. How did all of these things happen, and how is the calendar so weirdly strange this year? And what about the resurrection? I will tell you that the resurrection was very real. I absolutely believe in it. And I can even tell you the biblical date on which it happened. It was on Yom HaBikurim, 3 days after the Last Supper, the Feast of First Fruits. And Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, Messiah as first fruits has risen from the dead. Well, yeah, because he rose on the Feast of First Fruits 3 days after the Last Supper. But we'll talk more about that and how we got to where we are in 2 weeks on April 12th. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, we thank you for your word and for this time together. Lord, you are with us and you teach us. Let us remember that everything in your word has importance for us, not just as historical fact, but in our present lives and in our future. We thank you for this time, for the giving of your word so that we may study it. B'Shem Yeshua, or in Jesus' name, amen. Shabbat Shalom and Laila Tov, or good night.